All right, this is the second chapter in Tara Kuther's Lifespan Development in Context, and this chapter covers biological and environmental foundations and prenatal development. I'm trying to think of the structure of the book, Lifespan in Context, and I think it focuses on the contexts first and the lifespan in those contexts. But evidently, we're seeing a context here, which is biological and environmental foundations of development, and a life stage, prenatal development. So I'm not sure if there will be subsequent chapters on biological and environmental foundations or if it's unique to prenatal development. I guess we will see as the textbook progresses. Now, a disclaimer, I am not a biological psychologist, and I've done no research in prenatal development. So these are two areas in which I am not very skilled. So what I will be giving is very vague summaries of these topics and the occasional example, but I'll be learning along with you. The first topic of focus is genetics. And genetics, briefly, can be introduced as the biological material that creates your potential, or it sets the ceiling and floor and walls. It gives you the space of what you can develop into. So, for example, you may have a genetic predisposition to be tall, which means that being short is not in the cards for you, or the reverse. In some cases, your genetic predisposition will actualize in your growth. In other cases, certain environmental opportunities will allow genetic material to be expressed, and other environments will prevent genetic material from being expressed. So genes often set the parameters for what you can become, but the environment is what helps the actual genetic expression. So we can break down genes into chromosomes, or the genetic material into chromosomes, genes, and DNA. And again, I would have to review human biology to really remember exactly what the relationship is between these. As far as I'm concerned, each one of these components can help us understand and predict the developmental capacity of every person, and each of them kind of hold different material properties that can help us understand that. So breaking down into this is cell replication or DNA replication. There's mitosis and meiosis, are types of cell divisions, cell productions, and zygote is what you get when two people have intercourse, or there is, I think that this chapter actually gets into alternative forms of fertilization, but that's when a male sperm and female egg combine to create a zygote. And so in the zygote, you have all of the genetic material that will go into producing a human fetus. During the process from zygote to fetus and eventually birthed infant, twins can be created two different ways. Two eggs can be fertilized with dizygotic twins, or one egg can be fertilized and then divide, and then two separate sets of DNA are replicated, and then that one cell becomes two separate entities, grows into two separate organisms. That's monozygotic twins. And I suspect, I don't know if this is true, but I suspect that dizygotic twins are likely to occur, or only occur, if more than one egg is released, which only happens when there's a fertilization treatment. That might be wrong, but that's always been my understanding of it. Dominant recessive inheritance. Okay, I think there's a couple of pictures maybe somewhere later on. Dominant recessive inheritance describes which genes from mom or dad, or which genes they carry, will be expressed in the fetus or in the infant. So I was born with blonde hair, like platinum blonde hair. I have a little bit of it left, but now it's mostly brown. My mom had red hair, and because I was her child, I carry the gene for red hair, but it didn't get expressed. So it's a recessive gene in me, and it's possible that if I had kids, I would have a red-haired child, but it's unlikely because my wife is blonde, I was blonde. So we'll probably have a blonde kid, but there's like like a 25% chance that we would have a red-haired child. Okay, so there are types of genetic inheritance. There are ways in which a gene will get passed down. So I just talked about red hair and blonde hair. My dad had blonde hair. My mom had red hair and I had blonde hair. The dominant parent there was blonde, so I'm more likely to have a blonde child. So there's incomplete dominance, which means that both genes influence a characteristic. With blonde hair and red hair, there's a dominant gene. I don't know exactly what the dominant what the other dominant examples are in hair color, but maybe brown hair or really dark hair. If there's an example of both, then maybe they would combine. So in incomplete dominance, the two genes would combine to create something new, and evidently sickle cell trait is one of those. Genomic imprinting is the expression of a gene determined by whether it's inherited from mother or father. So evidently, and this is a surprise to me, I don't remember this, it matters whether or not your mom is passing the gene on to you or your dad is passing the gene on to you. So you'll only get the gene if it comes from a specific parent. Then polygenic inheritance, traits are formed through the interaction of many genes. Okay, so these are more complicated than hair color and height, for example. So intelligence is many components that all kind of get added together. If you can't tell, I find all of this incredibly dull. Chromosomal and genetic abnormalities. It's possible that during the genetic replication cycles, a mistake occurs or a mutation happens, and so in some cases that can lead to genetic disorders that the person lives with their entire life, or perhaps they won't survive very long, or they'll have greater mortality. But it's also possible, Down syndrome is one of those examples, it's also possible that some problem happens and then that problem actually makes a person more likely to reproduce or smarter or stronger, more likely to survive. And so those mutations actually create branches in human evolution. People with this like random mutation actually survive better, and so now that mutated gene is more likely to be passed on. And so that's the argument behind evolution, that it begins by these mutations, these mistakes that just randomly happen to have survival value in a given society. All right, so I mentioned assisted reproductive technology. Sex isn't the only way to fertilize eggs, so there's alternative methods of conception. I guess that ART is assisted reproductive technology. I didn't know that was an acronym. Artificial insemination is when sperm is injected into a woman, not through intercourse, but through some other way. In vitro fertilization is when the egg is removed from the woman and then fertilized there and then placed back into the uterus. So the egg is removed and fertilized, placed back. And surrogacy is hiring somebody to carry the child. And I suspect the same thing. So the egg is removed from the woman, fertilized, and then put into a surrogate woman who carries the baby to term. And so there's no genetic material from the surrogate. But perhaps there's more that is communicated through the lifestyle of the surrogate. It would be an interesting psychology study. All right, so I mentioned earlier that genes by themselves set the limits for human development, but it's not just genes, because the genes may not always express in a human who develops. So a phenotype is the traits and characteristics we display that are a result of the interactions of genotypes and our environment and our experience. So there's genotype, which is the capacity, and phenotype is the actual expression of that. Behavioral genetics looks at how genes and experience combine to influence the diversity of human traits. So how much of how I'm dressed right now and how I talk is purely genetic, and how much of that is based on the people I've surrounded myself with and the experiences that I've had. So behavioral genetics looks at all those combinations. Heritability is the extent to which variation among people on a given characteristic is due to genetic differences. and I just realized that I never checked the microphone, so I really hope I really hope this is recording, because I don't want to record it again. Heritability, did I already say that? That sounds redundant to me. The extent to which variation among people on a given characteristic is due to genetic differences. Okay, I guess the difference between myself and my wife, our personality differences, our behavioral differences, our physical differences, how much of that is due to the genes that make us up? We would call that heritability. I don't know why you would want to use the word that way or need a word at all. Twin studies and adoption studies. In order to test whether or not genes are responsible for personality, or genes are responsible for psychological disorders or propensity for alcoholism or something, it's helpful to have twin studies. That way you can control for environment. There's a relationship, thank you, thumbs up sign. There's a relationship between alcoholism and genetics, and so people with alcoholic parents or grandparents are more likely to become alcoholics themselves. But does that mean that being around alcoholics makes you more likely to become an alcoholic, or is there some gene that's passed down? So if there's one twin, shares all of the same genetic material with another twin, one grows up with alcoholics, the other does not, do both of them turn into alcoholics or have the same capacity for alcoholism? And so twin studies can help us control for environment factors and test genes alone. I'm going to try to pick it up a little bit because we're only a third of the way through. Genetic influences on personal characteristics include sociability, temperament, emotionality, and susceptibility to various illnesses. So these are genetic predispositions to our social identity, emotional identity, and capability of fighting off disease. And then, so vague, certain factors are affected by environmental circumstances. And as I've said earlier, in order for some genes to be expressed, there has to be an environmental context for it to occur, in which it can occur. So this is the expression of genes in a specific environment. We can talk about what certain genes do in certain environments. So now, as you can imagine, we're really getting into the interaction between genes and their expression, their invitation to be expressed in an environment. There's a word here, canalization. Heredity is narrowing the range of development to only one or a few outcomes. So that would mean a gene can only be expressed in a couple of different ways. There's a canal, and so the gene can only be expressed in this range. So environment can influence it this much, but you would never find something way outside of the canal, if you will. So the range of reaction would be very narrow in canalization, I guess is how it would be pronounced. Gene-environment correlations. Genetically influenced traits tend to be associated with environmental factors that promote their development. No duh. So like if a tree was growing in a high wind area, likely it would have a strong root base to prevent it from falling over in high winds. So the gene and the environment both complement the growth of a thick root base. Epigenetics talk about or examine the way environments shape genetic expression, which I find way more interesting than genetics itself. So just because you have a gene doesn't mean it will be expressed. You can have a gene for being a heavy weightlifter, so you might put on muscle mass really well, but if you've never encountered weightlifting, that gene will never find its expression. And you'd have no reason to suspect that you would have that capability. There's a short window of time during which the egg is released from the ovaries and it passes down the fallopian tubes and it's ready for fertilization. And only during that time can a woman conceive. Once the egg is fertilized and the zygote is created, so that happens in the fallopian tubes. It ends up ideally getting embedded in the uterine wall and hopefully not in the fallopian tube, which can lead to, I think, ectopic pregnancy, something like that, which can be very dangerous. My wife would be so disappointed in me. She's a physician assistant. Okay. In the first 2 weeks, the zygote, the now fertilized zygote, just continues down the fallopian tube to be embedded in the uterine wall, and then the cell begins to implant blastocyst, a fluid-filled sphere with cells forming protective circle around the inner cluster of cells from which the embryo will develop. Sounds like a protective coating around the cell that protects it from infection or bacteria or anything in the uterus, and then it eventually connects to the uterine wall. And then from 3 to 8 weeks, we see another change. The embryo starts to, so we're no longer zygote, it's now embryo, so like the cells are starting to combine, and we don't have just a single cell, it's like growing into the embryo. And then we start to see different layers, distinct layers, so complexity within this organism. There's an amnion fluid, so it's a membrane that holds amniotic fluid, providing temperature regulation, cushioning, and protection, so more of a more sophisticated protection measure. The placenta is the organ that exchanges nutrition and waste with the mother. In the embryo, you've got the neural tube, which is the basic central nervous system. And if something terrible happens during this period, it could cause a miscarriage or a spontaneous abortion. Then there's a period from 9 weeks to birth called the fetal period. So now we have the fetus. This is during the 12th week, the upper limbs. I'll let you read this. There are different physiological achievements at each of these weeks. I'm sure the book has a neat little chart with all of these things, perhaps with pictures. During this process, we can diagnose problems using ultrasound, MRI, amniocentesis, CVS, and non-invasive prenatal testing. I don't know what all of those are, so I'm not going to go through them. A teratogen is anything that causes damage to prenatal development. So it's just a vocabulary word. Types of teratogens, or the study of teratogens, deal with when problems can occur, and then what sort of treatments, perhaps what sort of treatments can be used, but definitely the types of genesis of these problems. And evidently there are some problems that take a long time to finally express. What can influence teratology? Cigarette use, e-cigarette use, marijuana, cocaine, opioids, alcohol, and so on. So this is why it's recommended that a pregnant woman not engage in these activities, these substances. I'm not sure why this is listed under racial disparities, but there is the criminalization of maternal substance abuse. So the use of cocaine, for example, would be abusive to a growing fetus and could result in, cocaine use by itself is criminal, or has been criminalized. And perhaps alcoholism would be criminalized. I'm not sure what the laws are in the United States. Context teratogens interactions, so the relationship between potentially harmful substances and the environment in which you're in. Okay, so if you have superior care, maybe these teratogens aren't as impactful. In order to do well as a pregnant mother and the growing child, it's important to eat proper nutrition and have the correct balance of vitamins and minerals. And so there's certain problems that are related to different deficits in specific vitamins and minerals, for example, folic acid. Becoming ill while pregnant has grave consequences for a fetus, and so the health of the mother is very important, specifically really fatal diseases. And the emotional well-being of the mother is important too, to reduce chronic stressors, because those are communicated to the fetus, and it's possible, I don't know if this gets into it, but if you're pregnant during a period of mourning or crisis, then the infant is more likely to be predisposed to crisis behavior. So like being pregnant during the Great Depression, when there wasn't very much food, leads to infants that will gorge themselves whenever they have an opportunity because they were developed in this like crisis depleted state. So that's pretty interesting, I think. Maternal age, there's a relationship between maternal age and risk of complications, and so in mid to late 30s, risk for complication goes up, especially after 40s. As you get older as a mother, the risk of having a child with Down syndrome increases, so that again was a chromosomal abnormality. However, today, many people wait until their mid-30s to have children and have healthy infants. So again, having good care, avoiding teratogens, can all support the development of a healthy baby. A thorough account of prenatal care includes what the husband is doing, or what the father is doing, excuse me. I didn't know this. Advanced paternal age is associated with increased risk of congenital and chromosomal abnormalities. So the age of the father does matter. Parents pass on epigenetic markers that can influence their offspring's health throughout life. So that means what the parents encounter and how their genes express can then be passed down to infants, maybe a greater likelihood of developing these certain traits. So it's not just the gene that's passed on, but there's epigenetic qualities that get passed on as well. There are certain factors in predicting quality prenatal care, such as access to health insurance or health care, ability to find childcare, whether or not someone's able to take off work, level of stress, and so there are a lot of factors that can predict healthy maternal periods and prenatal development. Women of color historically are less likely to receive quality prenatal care. Maybe that's why earlier there was like the racial characteristic. So groups least likely to seek prenatal care are economically disadvantaged members, whether it's impossible for them to take off work or find childcare, or just don't have access to the resources. All right, we are about 7 slides from the end. So there are 3 stages of child labor. I'll let you read about those. My wife and I did not have any children, and so I didn't encounter this directly, and I'm not too eager to do so now. So most U.S. births have some sort of anesthetics or use of an epidural, which makes the felt experience less severe to the mother. Some argue that you lose out on some of like the emotional connection, but it's become pretty common now. A cesarean delivery is when there's a surgical procedure, so the infant is not passed through the vagina in a natural way, that they're actually cut out. If the infant is reversed, so the head isn't pointed down towards the vagina, it's called a breech position, and it's very dangerous to deliver a baby that way, a fatal way for the mother and the child, and so that's usually when the cesarean has to be performed for safety's sake. Once you have a cesarean, you cannot have a natural childbirth, which is when you pass it through the vagina, you pass the infant through the vagina. There are methods to performing a natural childbirth, and so again, natural I think would not use an epidural either, and so there are ways to kind of naturally reduce pain, such as through breathing methods, having somebody nearby to help with the process. If you choose to have your childbirth at home, you would use a midwife, so a healthcare professional who specializes in managing that, because you don't have access to all of the safety precautions as you would in a hospital. All right, this is an interesting international and global difference that we see in child rearing or childbirth practices. In the U.S., it's usually like the physician and a couple of nurses and maybe like a family member or two. Very small group of people in the hospital. But in African and like native cultures, so even in the U.S., Canada, North America, native cultures, it's a very community-based event. So like there needs to be everybody there supporting the process, and so it's very unusual in like a modern Western U.S. setting to have like a dozen people in the room, none of whom are like health experts, but that's very common in native or community-based cultures. So a very shocking difference if you're used to one over the other. I didn't know this. Evidently, there is a scale for how well the baby's doing called the Apgar scale, between 0, 1, or 2. So you can have a scale of 0 through 2, and it doesn't say which is high and which is good and which is bad. Childbirth predicts mortality and health, and healthfulness of the infant. You can take a look at how many infants in each of these birth rate categories there are, birth weight categories there are. So racial differences in low birth weight are not a function of income and other factors such as racism and discrimination. Interesting. Kangaroo care describes the skin-to-skin contact between infant and caregiver. So this is important for the development of infants, but especially for infants with low birth weight to actually have physical contact, maybe to communicate that it's okay, like you're in a safe environment, and so there's a lot that can be communicated through the pulse of another person. And then ideally the mothers are involved and they know what they're doing with their low birth weight infants. If that happens, then there's likely going to be a good outcome. All right, and that's it. I suffered through it. If you made it to the end of this video, you suffered through it too. This is one in particular where you're going to want to take a careful look at the chapter because I have very few insights to provide.